Jacob Reed disappeared at 4:07 in the afternoon when he was on his way home from the school bus. A week later, he was found in an abandoned railway tunnel. The forensic examination established a fact that disturbed even experienced investigators. Jacob was still alive for several days after his disappearance. It happened in the suburb of Dalewood, a small and normally quiet place in the northwestern United States. At 4:07 in the afternoon, 8-year-old Jacob Reed got off the bus at the intersection of Brooks Avenue and Oak Street. The walk from the bus stop to home took only 7 minutes. That day, Jacob never arrived at his front door. Jacob's mother, Julia Reed, called the police at exactly 4:41 in the afternoon, half an hour after her son should have returned. In the following week, police and volunteers combed the area until the search led to an abandoned railway tunnel 3 kilometers from Jacob's house. There, Jacob was found. He lay curled up in a corner. The forensic examination later confirmed he had still lived for several days after his disappearance. The police immediately recognized that this case would be more complicated than it initially seemed. The evidence was unusual and every witness told a different story. The first unusual detail was the 19-centimeter-long imprint of a bare foot on the moist earth beside the road that Jacob normally took. No one could explain why the boy's shoes were not found nearby. This was the first puzzle that raised doubts about a random occurrence. The second detail emerged on the night of the same day when police examined the Reed family house. The window in Jacob's bedroom was opened a crack from the inside. The parents claimed they had closed it every night, out of fear of drafts. Someone had opened it after Jacob's disappearance, or immediately before. The third detail emerged during questioning of the neighbors. 46-year-old Mark Ellison, the neighbor from across the street, claimed to have seen Jacob last. However, his statement was contradictory. Ellison first said he had seen Jacob at 4:10 in the afternoon, but then corrected the time to 4:25 in the afternoon. The police noted the discrepancy but decided to check his statement later. Aidan Reed, Jacob's 15-year-old brother, also came under police scrutiny. He stated that he was at football training at that time, but his alibi was not yet confirmed. It also turned out that Aidan had argued with Jacob about toys on the morning of the same day. The investigators decided not to exclude jealousy between the brothers as a possible motive for the time being. First, the police concentrated on the obvious suspects. The older brother, Aidan Reed, was the first to be checked. Jacob had recently received a new toy, an expensive toy dinosaur that Aidan had been unsuccessfully asking his parents for several months. On the morning of the disappearance, the brothers had argued fiercely precisely because of this toy, but Aidan firmly insisted that he had gone directly to training after school and denied meeting his brother after school. Another person who immediately aroused suspicion was a homeless man known to locals by the nickname Skipper. He was the one who brought Jacob's wallet to a gas station on the morning after Jacob's disappearance and claimed to have found it in the parking lot. Skipper was known to police for petty theft, but had never been connected with serious crimes. Nevertheless, the police decided to check him more closely. Aidan Reed had argued with Jacob about the dinosaur in the morning. The police learned this from the boy's mother, but had no confirmation of his alibi yet. An important point was information about a camera installed near the school stadium. The camera could confirm or refute Aidan's version, but on the first day of the search, police had no time to examine the recordings. The first 24 hours of the investigation were drawing to an end. At 9:30 in the evening on the day after Jacob's disappearance, police discovered crucial evidence: the toy dinosaur that the brothers had argued about in the morning. The toy lay in a trash bin directly across from Mark Ellison's house, the neighbor whose statement was raising more and more doubts. The police officers drew no hasty conclusions. They had already understood that they were dealing not only with the disappearance, but with something much more complex and confusing than it seemed at first glance. An hour before Jacob's disappearance, Aidan had deleted the entire chat history on his mobile phone. What exactly was the older brother trying to hide? And was it connected to the disappearance? Police specialists restored Aidan's deleted messages using a cloud backup. The chat history was simple, typical for a teenager of his age. Aiden was arguing with his father about pocket money. Recently, the parents had begun strictly controlling Aiden's expenses. Now he had to justify to his friends why he could no longer participate in their usual activities. But among the harmless messages, police came across a sentence that was sent a few hours before Jacob's disappearance. Today, everything will be decided. This sentence seemed suspicious to investigators, especially considering the brothers' morning conflict. The coach of Aiden's football team, Steve Henson, confirmed to investigators that the teenager was at training, which had begun at 3:45 in the afternoon. But when checking video recordings from the school parking lot camera, an important discrepancy emerged. Aiden left the sports grounds at 4:25 in the afternoon, which was 35 minutes before the official end of training. Why Aiden had lied about the time of his departure remained unclear. Aiden's interrogation took place in the presence of his parents. Aiden behaved calmly, although his answers seemed overly cautious several times. First, he explained that after training he had waited for his parents in the school parking lot, as they had promised to pick him up at 7:30 in the evening. Then Aiden changed his statement and said he had left early because he was tired of waiting and decided to walk home. The distance to the house was slightly more than 1 kilometer, and the teenager claimed he had not seen Jacob on the way. However, a surveillance camera at the school exit recorded Aiden not going toward his house but in the opposite direction, toward where Jacob's wallet was later found. It was precisely this circumstance that prompted investigators to seriously reconsider the older brother's words. When police officers pointed out this contradiction to Aiden, he fell silent and stared attentively at his feet. His father urgently admonished him to tell only the truth. After that, Aiden calmly explained that he had gone to the nearest store to meet a friend. Aiden refused to give the friend's name, citing a promise. The investigators noted this moment separately as they understood that the teenager was concealing something. In the evening, police received an unexpected call from forensic technicians. A large trace of brown clay was discovered on Aiden's football jersey. In itself, this would have meant nothing if there had not been an important circumstance. The clay visually resembled that which was present at Jacob's discovery site. The distance from the school stadium to the abandoned tunnel where Jacob was later found was about 3.5 kilometers. The investigators calculated the time and determined that Aiden could not possibly have reached there and back on foot without attracting attention and arriving home late. Nevertheless, police could not ignore this evidence. With the parents' consent, Aiden's shoes were taken for a more thorough examination of soil samples. Forensic technicians took samples from the jersey and sent them for urgent laboratory analysis. While waiting for results, the investigation continued questioning the teenager's acquaintances. Teachers described Aiden as a quiet and disciplined student, but in recent weeks, he had become more withdrawn and irritable. Classmates told police that Aiden suffered greatly from family conflicts and lack of money, but no one remembered anything concrete that could connect him with his brother's disappearance. At 10:15 in the evening of the same day, the laboratory reported the analysis results. The clay from Aiden's jersey, despite external similarity, differed significantly in its mineral composition from samples taken in the abandoned tunnel. This meant that the version that Aiden had visited this place on the day of Jacob's disappearance was not confirmed. Nevertheless, the investigators could not dismiss all suspicions against Aiden, as the teenager was obviously still hiding something. The police understood that they had to definitively confirm or refute his alibi using video cameras and find out the name of the mysterious friend Aiden had met with that day. At the moment, Aiden remained an important figure in the investigation. Although the investigators now tended more toward the assumption that he was not directly involved in his brother's disappearance. His actions required an explanation, but a direct connection to the crime was no longer apparent. The police decided to intensify surveillance of the teenager as it now had to be discovered what exactly he continued to hide from the investigators. While the investigations focused on Aiden, the police simultaneously examined the Reed family as a whole. One of the first oddities that drew the investigators' attention was the frequent replacement of door locks at the family house. In the last 6 months, this had happened 3 times. The family explained this with concern for security, but the details of these fears were not fully disclosed. However, further investigation quickly revealed the veil over the family circumstances. The investigators gained access to the family's financial reports and discovered a considerable number of debts. The Reed family was forced to pawn technology and household items at a local pawn shop to cover urgent expenses. According to information from the pawn shop, Joseph Reed, Jacob's father, regularly brought expensive electronics there. Laptops, tablets, as well as gaming consoles. All of this was repeatedly repawned with increasing credit amounts and interest. The pawnshop documents noted that the father's last visit had taken place only 2 days before Jacob's disappearance. The neighbors questioned by police also confirmed the problems in the family. In their statements, they told that in recent months they had regularly heard loud voices and arguments that took place late at night. Neighbor Caroline Miller, who lived 1 fence away from the Reed family, specified that one evening she clearly heard Joseph loudly tell his wife, "If this continues, I'll give him to those who can take better care of him." The investigators invited the parents for a separate conversation. Joseph Reed appeared visibly nervous, while his wife Julia seemed more confident. At first, Joseph denied serious financial difficulties and claimed the pawned items had been a temporary measure and the situation was under control. When the detectives directly asked about the frequent lock changes, Julia, while looking at her husband, answered that there had been a burglary attempt a few months ago, after which they had worried about the security of the house and their loved ones. However, when checked by police, it turned out that no official report about burglary attempts from the Reed family had been received at the local station. The investigators suspected a possible motive for Jacob's disappearance. Financial difficulties could have driven someone from the family's circle to a desperate step for ransom money. However, this version quickly lost relevance. Since the boy's disappearance, not a single call with money demands had come to the family. Nevertheless, the investigation continued to examine the incident with the nighttime arguments. The father's threats, recorded by neighbors, sounded serious. The phrase, "I'll give him to those who can take better care," became reason to carefully check all of Joseph Reed's contacts in recent months. The detectives conducted a detailed analysis of the parents' calls and correspondence, without finding a suspicious contact that could indicate preparation for a handover or secret agreement. The threats were apparently an emotional reaction to family problems that were not confirmed by practical actions. But the very fact of such statements led the investigation to conclude relationships in the family were tense and difficult long before Jacob's disappearance, which inevitably had to affect the general atmosphere in the house and the behavior of its members. On the evening of the same day, when it seemed that the investigation had exhausted all leads in the Reed family, the police technical department recorded an unusual incoming call to Joseph's mobile phone. The call came from an unregistered and unidentified number. The caller did not introduce himself and said only one word, almost in a whisper: "Tunnel." This call abruptly changed the course of the investigation. Police immediately took control of Joseph Reed's phone and initiated a technical check. The caller's voice was male, but his identity could not be immediately established. It also remained unclear why he had called the father specifically and what this single term meant. The Reed family was extremely disturbed. Joseph assured the investigation that he had not recognized the caller's voice. Julia, on the other hand, claimed she had no idea who could have made such a call and why. Both parents were advised to stay at home and inform police about all subsequent contacts. At this moment, the investigators' attention turned again to the family's external environment. It was decided to immediately trace this call to get at least a clue about the caller. Jacob's father became a key figure in the investigation for another reason. He might know more than he told police, without realizing it himself. The investigation continued to keep the family under the shadow of suspicion, although there was no direct evidence of their involvement in the disappearance. Nevertheless, it was clear to police. Someone close to the family knew much more than they were saying and was possibly connected to the circumstances that led to Jacob's disappearance. The vagrant, whom locals knew by the nickname Skipper, became a new important figure in the investigation of Jacob's disappearance. Previously, he had brought the boy's wallet to the gas station and claimed to have found it by chance in a trash bin. So far, this detail had no clear explanation and aroused police suspicion. The investigators requested the surveillance camera footage from the gas station where Skipper had discovered the wallet. Examination of the video recording brought unexpected results. On the evening of the disappearance, around 1832, the camera recorded a teenager who went to the trash bin and threw a small object into it. Analysis of the high-resolution recording confirmed that it was Jacob's wallet. Skipper appeared only an hour later, found the wallet by chance and took it with him. Police immediately conducted facial recognition of the teenager recorded on the video. The system identified him as Joe Lamb, an 11-year-old friend of Aiden whom Aiden himself had already mentioned in his statements. It seemed the investigators had found an important clue that could clarify the mystery of the wallet's whereabouts and the role of Aiden's friends in this matter. However, when police checked the information, they encountered a contradiction that again led them away from the right path. The video recording showed the time 1832. At this time, Aiden was already safely at home. This was confirmed by his parents and neighbors who had seen him at the house. Now, Joe Lamb had to be urgently found to understand his role in this situation and his motives. The search for Joe Lamb lasted all day. The investigators visited his house, but the door was opened by the teenager's mother, who was sincerely surprised and concerned about the police visit. She reported that Joe had been staying with his grandmother in the neighboring province for several days and had not returned to the city either on the day of the disappearance or afterward. This was also confirmed by GPS data from Joe's phone, which was provided by the mother. The investigators established that the teenager on the video recording only outwardly resembled Joe, but physically could not be him. Now the investigation returned again to the starting point, as the identity of the teenager from the video camera had to be clarified. Simultaneously, information was checked whether Skipper could have had any contacts with the family or their circle. Further questioning and checking his route, however, proved his innocence. Skipper had indeed found the wallet by chance and decided to bring it to the gas station, without knowing about Jacob's disappearance. The police had lost much time checking the version with Joe Lamb, but now this version was officially closed. The teenager whom the facial recognition system had falsely identified turned out to be a completely different person who had no direct relationship to the Reed family and their environment. The police concluded that the wallet had been intentionally placed by a third party whose identity remained unknown for now. Late in the evening, the football team coach, Steve Henson, voluntarily appeared at the station and reported that he had found important evidence. He handed over to the police a group photo of the team that had been taken one day before Jacob's disappearance. In the photo, it was clearly visible that on Aiden's right sneaker was the same brown clay stain that had previously aroused the investigators' suspicion. The experts immediately compared the clay sample from the photo with the data obtained in the laboratory. The results were clear. This clay had nothing to do with the location where Jacob was found. It was ordinary clay from the school stadium, where repair work on the lawn had been carried out just 1 week earlier. Thus, the version of possible involvement of Aiden in Jacob's disappearance was definitively closed. The investigation was convinced of his complete innocence. Now the investigators' attention focused completely on the mysterious call that had come to Joseph Reed's phone with the word tunnel. The unknown caller was obviously trying to communicate something, and the police understood that he was now the key to the entire mystery of what had happened. The next days of investigation were supposed to provide answers to the most important questions. The investigation had to find out who exactly had called and why he had used precisely this word. The clarification of all circumstances of Jacob Reed's disappearance depended on this information. While the police were trying to identify the teenager who had thrown away Jacob's wallet, The investigators' attention unnoticeably shifted to a person whose behavior had been puzzling from the beginning. Mark Ellison, the Reed family's neighbor, the same one who had first given a statement to the police and had gotten tangled up in details. During renewed questioning, the investigators asked him control questions about the place where Jacob was found. Ellison answered confidently that the height of the tunnel was 2 meters and 47 centimeters. Such precision seemed suspicious even to experienced detectives. When asked where he knew such details from, Ellison hesitated and answered that he had once been interested in this place out of curiosity. But his voice and gaze betrayed nervousness. Based on this, the investigation decided to conduct a preliminary inspection of Ellison's house with his consent. In the basement, the police found a professional laser distance meter, a device that can measure distances with millimeter precision. The presence of such a device in itself was not illegal, but seemed unusual for someone who claimed to be involved in ordinary household repairs. Besides the distance meter, another detail drew the detective's attention. Among the documents presented for inspection was an excerpt from an Amazon order that had been placed 2 months earlier. It involved children's furniture, a small wardrobe, and a bed. The strange thing about it was that the order was not placed in Mark's own name, but in the name Jacob E. The investigators could not ignore the fact that the first letters of Jacob Reed's first and last name matched the name specified in the order. During subsequent questioning, Ellison calmly explained that the children's furniture had been ordered for a guest room, but his words contradicted the facts that the police had previously discovered. In Ellison's house, there were no signs of converting a room into a guest or other living area. The children's furniture was in the garage, still in original packaging. The investigators insisted on explanations. Why was the furniture ordered in the name Jacob E? Ellison claimed it was only an error by the online shop that he had not corrected. But when checking with Amazon customer service, it became clear that the customer had entered the name himself when placing the order. Ellison became increasingly entangled, and the investigation began to understand that he had reasons to hide facts from the police. To dispel suspicion, Ellison voluntarily offered the police his DNA samples. Forensic experts immediately checked these samples with a quick primary test. The results came the same evening and were negative. Ellison's DNA did not match any of the traces found on the dinosaur toy that had previously been secured from the garbage container. For a short time, this seemed convincing proof of his innocence, but the police nevertheless decided to be cautious and conduct a more thorough examination of the object. Precisely this decision later completely changed the attitude toward the evidence. During examination of the toy under a powerful laboratory microscope, the forensic expert made a disturbing discovery. The surface of the toy dinosaur had been carefully treated with a chlorine-containing agent. All traces of foreign DNA had been purposefully chemically removed. This called into question the previous quick DNA test, which now seemed meaningless. The experts agreed. The dinosaur had been intentionally cleaned with chlorine to erase any traces. The investigators could not help but wonder, if Ellison is innocent, why would he clean an object directly related to Jacob's disappearance? Thus, Mark Ellison stopped being just a neighbor observer and became a person who obviously knew much more about details and evidence than he had previously admitted. Although the police could not yet name his motives, all indirect signs pointed to him. Ellison officially received the status of suspect. His house was cordoned off, and the investigation prepared for a comprehensive search. The police were aware that every detail in Ellison's house could provide the key to clarifying what had happened. While the motive remained hidden, and no one could understand what intentions the neighbor had regarding Jacob, the investigation focused on preparing the next step, a complete examination of the suspect's house and environment. Now it had to be found out what exactly Mark Ellison was hiding and what relationship he had to what had happened. The police no longer doubted that the end of this tangled story depended on him. While the police were preparing for a comprehensive search of Mark Ellison's house, Julia Reed unexpectedly drew the investigators' attention to herself again. When checking telephone records, the investigators noticed an unusual detail. On the day of Jacob's disappearance, Julia made 3 short calls to Ellison. The calls were registered at 14:02, 14:15, and 14:21. The duration of each call was no more than a few seconds. Julia, who was summoned for questioning, appeared visibly surprised when the investigators informed her of this information. She explained that she could not remember these calls, and then suggested that she had probably only accidentally dialed the number when trying to call someone else. Confidence sounded in her voice, but the police nevertheless doubted the truthfulness of her explanations. 3 random calls in a row to the same person within 20 minutes seemed unlikely. The investigators asked Julia directly whether she had not tried to contact Mark to ask him to watch Jacob or Aidan. Julia categorically denied this possibility. She insisted that she barely knew Ellison, except through brief greetings on the street. However, the investigators established that Julia and Mark had been neighbors for almost 3 years, and even if they did not maintain close contact, they certainly knew each other well enough not to confuse the telephone number. This aroused the police's suspicion that Julia might be hiding something or simply not being completely honest with law enforcement. Nevertheless, Julia confidently repeated that she had not given the neighbor any concrete requests or assignments. The investigators decided to accept her words for now, but marked Julia as a person who obviously was not revealing the whole truth. That same day, a post appeared on a local blog that was based on rumors and claimed that there had allegedly been an affair between Julia and Mark Ellison. The blog's author referred to the words of anonymous neighbors who claimed to have seen Julia and Mark talking to each other on the street late in the evening. The police could not ignore such rumors, as this could explain the strange behavior of both. To verify this version, investigators requested a detailed breakdown of Julia and Mark's phone bills for the last 3 months. However, analysis of the data confirmed no SMS correspondence or other indirect signs of personal relationships. The investigation concluded that this version was another false lead, and temporarily closed it to redirect their attention to more concrete evidence. Meanwhile, technical investigation continued in Mark Ellison's house. An unexpected discovery was made on his landline phone's answering machine. Police experts were able to recover a recorded but unsent draft of a voice message. The recording clearly featured a female voice, calm but slightly tense, saying, "Please call when you see Jake coming home." This message was not sent but remained in draft status. Police immediately compared the voice with Julia Reed's, but received no quick conclusion. The voices were similar, but for accurate confirmation, spectral analysis was required, which took time. This discovery significantly changed the situation. If the voice actually belonged to Julia, her explanation about random calls would completely collapse. However, if the voice was foreign, it meant there was another woman in the case whose role was completely unclear. Until the voice was identified, police decided to temporarily drop active suspicions against Julia and designate her in documents as a witness whose testimony required additional verification. Furthermore, investigators prepared for an important phase of the investigation. They received official permission for a thorough search of Mark Ellison's house, including checking for the presence of a secret room or chamber. Police suspected that discovering this room could provide important clues about events related to Jacob's disappearance. Thus, the main tasks for the next phase of investigation remained identifying the female voice from the answering machine and complete examination of Mark's apartment. Julia Reed temporarily receded into the background, but the investigation was not in a hurry to definitively remove her from the list, waiting for the results of spectral analysis. The investigation was approaching its climax, and each next clue could be decisive. Extensive operational measures began in Mark Ellison's house. Investigators inspected every room, but the basement attracted special attention. There, an unusual construction was discovered, a drywall that clearly differed from the others. Police broke it open by carefully removing the panels, and before them appeared a picture that shocked even experienced operatives. Behind the false wall was hidden a carefully arranged small room. It was an almost complete copy of Jacob Reed's bedroom. The same wall colors, similar furniture, and even identical decorative details. Most shocking was that on a shelf stood a toy, a plastic dinosaur, exactly the same as Jacob's favorite toy that had previously been found in the garbage container. The investigation immediately called Mark Ellison for explanation. He, who had remained calm until then, became visibly pale when he saw the dismantled wall. He began uncertainly to justify himself, saying he had only helped the Reed family with renovation, and the room was allegedly intended for Jacob at Jacob's mother's request. However, police quickly discovered that all furniture was new, ordered by Ellison himself, and had nothing to do with the Reed family's actual apartment. When investigators presented the neighbor with evidence that the furniture had been recently and specifically purchased under the name Jacob E., Ellison found no suitable words and fell silent. He no longer tried to deny the fact that he had arranged this room himself, although he refused to explain why he needed to create a complete copy of Jacob's room. Meanwhile, crime technicians began careful examination of the room. On one of the walls, they discovered several distinct fingerprints belonging to an adult, as well as a smaller one obviously belonging to a teenager. Initial database verification immediately ruled out that it was Jacob's fingerprint. Police suspected that someone else might have been in the room, possibly another person who had not yet appeared in the case. This discovery confused the investigation for several hours. Operatives even began checking versions about a possible additional kidnapped person or another unknown witness. It seemed that the investigation might again reach a dead end due to uncertainty with this fingerprint. Operatives began comparing the print with data from all acquaintances of the Reed family and Ellison. A special crime laboratory was brought in to accelerate the identification process. While police waited for results, Ellison himself sat in a separate room under observation and maintained visible calm, although tension became evident through his gestures and movements. The investigation no longer doubted his involvement, but all details of what happened needed to be clarified. Late in the evening of that day, experts from the Federal Criminal Office reported unexpected and simultaneously frightening results. After a repeated, more thorough examination, it turned out that the mysterious unknown fingerprint on the wall actually belonged to Jacob Reed. Originally, the print had been distorted by moisture in the room, which is why the recognition program could not immediately identify it. Now the situation changed drastically. It became completely clear that Jacob had spent at least several days in this hidden room. Furthermore, forensic experts, after comparing all evidence and room conditions, officially concluded that Jacob had spent 4 days in Ellison's house basement. The investigation established the exact date when Jacob was no longer alive. It happened on the 14th of May. Thus, the version that the boy was immediately taken to the tunnel after his disappearance proved completely untenable. Now investigators clearly understood that Ellison had hidden Jacob in his house and carefully disguised this. The neighbor definitively became the main suspect. Due to these circumstances, operatives began even more detailed examination of Ellison's entire house. Police searched for all written or digital evidence that could help understand his motives and intentions. Special interest was given to a possible diary or records of the suspect that could reveal details of his plan. The investigation was approaching the solution to the main mystery of this complex case, but understood that several important steps remained before complete clarification. Now, the entire focus of investigation concentrated on discovering Ellison's records and clarifying the true reason that led him to such an act. Early in the morning, investigators continued thorough search of Mark Ellison's house. In the garage, between old boxes labeled Taxes 2022, a worn notebook was found. It was a diary, written in clean, small handwriting. Inside, police found records that forced them to completely reevaluate the suspect's personality. Every page of the diary was dedicated to Jacob. Mark recorded literally everything: daily schedule, bus routes, favorite food, and even the boy's habits. On some pages, conversation fragments were recorded in detail that Ellison had heard through Jacob's bedroom's open window. These records were kept regularly over the last 9 months. Police understood that the neighbor was collecting as detailed information as possible and apparently had a concrete goal. But Ellison himself insisted during interrogation that he was only interested in psychology and recorded observations exclusively from personal interest. However, investigators immediately understood that this was only a clumsy justification attempt. When examining the diary, one repeatedly occurring phrase attracted special attention: new family. According to the records, Ellison planned to create a family according to his ideal conception, and Jacob was to become part of it. The diary showed that Mark had carefully thought through the kidnapping scenario and subsequent life with Jacob. He described situations as if they had already happened, fantasizing about joint breakfasts, outings, and walks. The investigators demanded explanations, but Ellison stubbornly remained silent and tried to stay distant and calm. In his behavior lay confidence in his own invulnerability. However, the details from the diary no longer allowed him to hide behind the mask of a neighbor who had accidentally found himself at the center of events. Additionally, one detail confused the investigators. The diary repeatedly mentioned a third person, someone with the name or designation M. Mark described him as Jacob's friend, which prompted the police to assume the existence of an accomplice or a second person involved in the events. The police spent several hours trying to determine the identity of this mysterious M by checking lists of Jacob's schoolmates, neighbors, and all of Ellison's acquaintances. Later, however, it turned out that no real person with this designation existed. M was only a fictional character created by Ellison's consciousness, possibly part of his strange fantasies about an ideal family life. This version was quickly discarded when the police realized they were losing valuable time by delving into the suspect's delusions. The most important and disturbing discovery awaited the investigators on the last page of the diary. There, under the date of Jacob's disappearance, was a record made deep in the night at 3:12 in the morning. Mark had written only one sentence that became the most important evidence in the case: "If everything goes wrong, the tunnel." These words had decisive importance since they had been written long before the police discovered Jacob. It became obvious that Mark Ellison considered the tunnel from the beginning as an emergency plan in case his plans should fail. Precisely this discovery confirmed that Ellison's actions were carefully planned and not accidental. His motive, however, remained unclear and incomprehensible until the end. The investigation recorded only one obvious detail. The suspect was obsessed with the idea of creating an ideal family. What his ultimate goal consisted of remained unknown for the time being, and the police were in no hurry to announce this before the end of the investigation. Now the investigators concentrated on searching for additional evidence that could strengthen their position in court. An important step was examining the tire treads of Mark Ellison's pickup to compare them with the tracks found near the tunnel. If the match was confirmed, this would be the final proof of his presence at the location where Jacob was later found. Mark Ellison was preliminarily officially arrested, and his house was sealed. The police officers understood that the final part of the investigation was near, and all forces were directed toward supporting the charges with indisputable evidence. The story was slowly but surely approaching its end, and now the investigation only had to place the final points in this frightening case. After a week of waiting and countless checks, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Laboratory confirmed the main evidence. The tire tracks discovered at the entrance to the tunnel matched perfectly with the profile of Mark Ellison's pickup. This was the irrefutable proof the investigators had been waiting for. Under the weight of irrefutable facts, Ellison could no longer deny the obvious. In one of the final interrogations, he finally confessed. According to his words, he wanted to give Jacob a better life. He was obsessed with the idea of creating a family that approached the ideal. That's exactly why he had built the secret room in the basement, a copy of the boys' room, and carefully collected information about his habits and preferences. However, Jacob did not accept the conditions offered to him. He did not want to adapt to the new reality and refused to call Ellison Papa. This led to despair and uncertainty in Ellison. On the night of the 14th of May, he administered a sedative to the boy to calm him. But an incorrectly calculated dose caused respiratory depression. When Mark realized what he had done, he decided to hide what had happened. In panic, he loaded Jacob into the pickup and drove him to the abandoned railway tunnel. There, he staged a situation that should look like an accident, hoping to gain time and avoid suspicion. After Ellison's confession, the investigation received further confirmations of his statements. Ellison's DNA was found on the sleeve of Jacob's school jacket. This trace had not been washed away and was the final proof of physical contact. Additional confirmation was provided by a recording from Highway 16 surveillance cameras. The video camera clearly recorded Ellison's pickup driving toward the tunnel at 2:47 in the morning. Comparing the camera recordings with information from the suspect's diary confirmed the exact time of his departure from home. The distance from Ellison's house to the boy's discovery site was about 3.5 kilometers, and this journey took exactly 6 minutes. The investigators could reconstruct the events almost minute by minute. All details of the crime now fit together into a unified, comprehensible picture. On the day of arrest, when the police conducted a final search in the garage, Mark suddenly came out of his stupor. When he realized there was no way out, he tried to open a gasoline canister and threatened to set the room on fire. The investigators knew they could not give in. They approached the suspect carefully and tried to calm him, while Ellison shouted that everything was over and he could no longer bear the pressure. The tense negotiations lasted several minutes until Ellison finally gave up, put the canister on the floor and let his hands drop. This was the last episode of his resistance. The trial against Mark Ellison began in November 2024. Despite the detailed evidence and confession from Ellison himself, some details of his motive were never fully made public. Psychologists explained Ellison's behavior during the trial with the compulsive desire to create a family he considered ideal. However, the exact reason for choosing precisely this tunnel remained hidden from the general public and was included in the confidential part of the files. On the 20th of November 2024, Mark Ellison was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of early release on parole. After the verdict was announced, he was taken to Wabash Prison, where he would spend the rest of his life. The investigation was officially closed. The police closed all previously arising versions and false leads. Jacob's older brother Aiden was completely exonerated and declared innocent. The homeless man nicknamed Skipper was classified as a random witness who had nothing to do with the crime. The suspicions against Jacob's father also proved false and were dropped. The only thing that remained secret was the final psychological motive that explained why Ellison chose precisely this tunnel for completing his plan. Experts only cautiously suspected that this was connected with Mark's attempt to unconsciously return to his own childhood. But this question remained definitively in the confidential part of the files. Thus ended one of the most sensational and tragic stories of Dalewood suburb. The investigation had fulfilled its task, restored justice and clarified all key questions, leaving only one detail without a final answer. But precisely this detail will long provide material for discussions and debates among those who were familiar with this investigation. The online game ended tragically. A teenager could not cope with defeat and transformed his anger into a cruel attack on a disabled classmate. Garden tools became the murder weapon, and the motives and details of this cruel act proved to be far more complex than it initially seemed. The call to police came in at exactly 16:05. A neighbor reported that she had heard loud screams from the backyard of the neighboring property. At the crime scene, police discovered teenager Ethan M. without signs of life. He was located in a small greenhouse that was hidden behind Blake Kay's house. Blake himself was arrested on the spot. He was obviously in shock, with clear blood traces on his clothing and hands. An initial examination revealed Ethan died from blows with garden tools that were found next to the arrested teenager. During the first examination of the crime scene, investigators noticed several important details. traces of melted polyethylene were found on Ethan's clothing, which could indicate an attempted arson. Crime technicians discovered 3 deep notches on a metal post of the greenhouse that matched the machete found nearby. Also clearly visible were continuous wheel tracks from Ethan's wheelchair that led from the rear garden gate directly into the greenhouse. The first and most obvious suspect was Blake K. He was at the crime scene and did not attempt to flee. The teenager was known for his explosive temperament and aggressive reactions to defeats in online games. The second suspect was Blake's father, Ian K. His garden tools had been used in the attack. Neighbors reported that serious conflicts regularly occurred between Ian and his son. The third possible suspect was a gardener who had been seen on the property the day before. Initially, the suspicions against Ian K. seemed justified. The tools belonged to him, and the conflicts with his son were confirmed by neighbors. But soon, investigators received a video recording from a Ring camera installed at the neighboring house. On the recording, it was clearly visible how Blake independently retrieved the machete from the garage half an hour before the incident. At the same time, Ian was at his workplace at the harbor, which was confirmed by surveillance cameras and official access system data. The suspicions against Ian K. fell away completely. The investigator who checked Blake's recordings and correspondence discovered that the teenagers had played an online game against each other just minutes before the incident. The game ended with Blake's defeat. Exactly after that, he took the machete and went toward the greenhouse. Why are there no fingerprints from Ian K. on the machete, although he constantly used the tool? At 9 o'clock in the morning, investigator James O'Connor drove again to the harbor warehouse where Ian K. worked. The police officer intended to finally verify the alibi and carefully examine details that could not be uncovered in the first hours of investigation. By this point, it had become obvious. If Ian was uninvolved, then he would be the key that would enable a deeper understanding of Blake's personality and motives. Ian was tall, athletic, outwardly calm, but clear fatigue could be heard in his voice. He repeated yesterday's statements without unnecessary words and confirmed again that he was at work the entire time while the attack took place. To confirm these words, police requested data from the electronic access system to the harbor warehouses. An independent server registered every entry and exit with minute precision. According to the protocol, Ian entered the premises at 15:30, and his car did not leave the warehouse area until 17:45. Additional confirmation was obtained from the dock surveillance camera. Clear footage showed Ian at the wheel of a forklift at exactly 16 o'clock. At this time, the tragedy had already occurred practically 8 kilometers from his workplace. Investigator O'Connor carefully checked the possibility that Ian could have left the warehouse unnoticed, committed the attack, and returned again. Police route analysis showed the distance from the warehouse to the house is exactly 8 kilometers. Even with the fastest drive by private car, the journey in one direction takes about 12 minutes. Additionally, cameras at the harbor entrance and exit clearly showed that Ian's private car remained in the parking lot from the moment of his arrival until 17:40. The version that Ian could have left his workplace unnoticed seemed practically untenable. But the investigation's attention was drawn to another moment. The gas station receipt found by police. Purchase time, 14:55, just before the attack. The receipt was paid in cash, and the gas station was located exactly halfway between the harbor and Ian's house. Initially, this seemed suspicious. Ian could well have fueled another car, not his own, and thus evaded the harbor cameras. However, the version of Ian's involvement with this receipt soon began to crumble. Crime technicians asked Ian to provide handwritten records he had made in recent days. The handwriting was immediately sent for examination. The results brought surprising news. The handwriting characteristics on the receipt completely matched handwriting samples from Blake K. taken from his school notebook. Thus, the version was not confirmed that Ian secretly fueled a car for a secret trip. Again and again, Blake's father proved to be unsuspicious. Nevertheless, This fact led the investigation to another important detail. Blake K. moved with someone's car or used other transportation. This significantly expanded the investigation area. While suspicions of Ian K. were being cleared, the investigation began to look more attentively at Ethan's environment. Until now, the gardener had remained unnoticed, who had visited the property the day before and possibly left tools behind or taken them away. At the same time, Blake had to explain why he fueled in advance with cash and whose car he used, if it wasn't his father's. Meanwhile, Ian K., already removed from the list of active suspects, revealed to police his son's personality from another side. According to his words, Blake was becoming increasingly withdrawn, aggressive, and unpredictable. He admitted that his son often became beside himself when defeated in video games, but could not imagine that such aggression would ever leave his room. In those same minutes, experts finished checking the tools confiscated at the crime scene. Strangely, no fingerprints from Ian were found on the handles of the machete and garden shears, although he used these tools daily in the garden. This meant that someone had carefully erased or altered these traces shortly before the tragedy, and this person obviously could not be Ian K. himself, since his alibi was absolutely watertight. Why did Ethan's mother delete part of her son's correspondence in advance? The investigation changed direction again. After Blake's father was completely cleared of suspicions, attention focused on Ethan M.'s environment. Police began a detailed analysis of the Ethan family's digital devices, and this brought unexpected discoveries. On Ethan's mother's computer, experts discovered strange activity. A few hours before the incident, more precisely at 15:12 on the same day, someone had logged into Ethan's account. IP address verification showed clearly. Access occurred directly from the Ethan family's house. Since Ethan himself was not at home at this time, the logical assumption arose. Only the teenager's mother could have done this. When the investigator asked directly about this episode, Ethan's mother denied that she had used her son's account or had any access to his correspondence at all. Nevertheless, experts restored deleted fragments of Discord correspondence that had previously been intentionally deleted. In it, Blake's aggressive reaction to the lost online match was clearly documented. A message that Blake sent at 15:22 sounded like a direct threat against Ethan because of messing up the game. This was not just an angry sentence, but a fairly serious warning. Investigator O'Connor spoke again with Ethan's mother and asked her to explain why these messages were deleted from the teenager's computer. The mother answered that she knew nothing about any threats against her son and had never read his private messages, but the digital evidence contradicted her words. The login to the account occurred from her home PC, and someone obviously tried to hide the correspondence that had direct relation to Blake. The mother's statements began to raise questions during the investigation, as she obviously could not have overlooked these messages while deliberately deleting fragments connected to Blake. The investigators suspected that this might have happened from an attempt to hide details of a conflict that possibly began much earlier and was more serious than it initially seemed. Parallel to the investigation of Ethan's environment, the investigators conducted a conversation with the gardener's son, who had previously been left on the sidelines of the investigation. The teenager, 13-year-old Jackson, explained to the investigation that he had allegedly given Blake cheats that helped with winning in online games. Jackson also added that Blake now owed him something. At this moment, it seemed to the investigation as if they had encountered an important motive connected with debts and manipulations. However, further verification showed that Jackson's words were nothing more than juvenile boasting. No real evidence for the use of programs or other manipulations was found. Nevertheless, they officially left this version open for now and waited for additional confirmations or refutations. Meanwhile, experts examined the archive of Ring camera recordings on the Blake family property. A video recording from the 30th of March, 5 days before the tragedy, showed an unusual and disturbing detail. In the footage, Blake clearly tested the machete by striking an old mattress that was set up in the backyard. The blow was executed once with a clearly calculated movement precisely in the center. For the investigation, this became a serious signal. Blake prepared for the attack in advance, and the incident in the greenhouse was not a spontaneous reaction to defeat. The appearance of this video turned around the picture of the incident and showed that the conflict between Ethan and Blake had been simmering for a long time, and the online game was only the last drop. The police received a new investigation vector according to which Blake's behavior might have been planned in advance, and the conflict in Ethan's environment had been known for a long time. The neighbor hears 4 metal strikes. The greenhouse alarm system recorded 3. Who is mistaken? 6 days had already passed since the tragedy in Blake's house backyard turned the neighbors' lives upside down and triggered deep shock in the quiet suburb. The forensic technicians continued their work methodically and thoroughly. The investigation's attention was drawn to an unusual detail that had previously been overlooked. During an additional questioning conducted by investigator O'Connor, the neighbor who had first called the police reported an important detail. The woman said with certainty that at the moment of the incident she had heard exactly 4 characteristic metallic sounds that resembled strikes of a tool against something hard. However, when forensic technicians checked the security system data installed in the greenhouse once more, they saw only 3 registered sounds. This discrepancy required explanations. The greenhouse alarm system was clearly set to capture sharp sounds with specific frequency and volume. Any sound below the set threshold could be overlooked by the system. Based on this, investigators concluded that one of the strikes must have been much weaker than the others. What could have been the cause of such a quiet strike? The answer came after several hours when forensic technicians examined the crime scene again and compared all collected evidence. In the evidence package, garden shears with an unusual blade shape appeared, slightly curved and intended for finer work. On their handle, Ethan's blood was discovered as well as clear fingerprints from Blake. This tool became the second part of the grim puzzle. But most importantly, it could provide the explanation for the discrepancy in sounds. The shears were much lighter than the machete and produced a less pronounced metallic sound when striking. Experts confirmed this hypothesis experimentally by comparing the alarm sensor recording and conducting tests under identical conditions. Now it became clear why one of the strikes was overlooked by the surveillance system. The main question remained: to whom did these shears belong? The investigation's initial assumption that they might be a gardener's tool quickly dissolved. During detailed examination, forensic technicians noticed a small, barely visible inventory label on the handle. The serial number on it completely matched a set of garden tools that belonged to Ethan's family. Thus, this tool belonged exactly to the injured party and not to the worker or Blake. The gardener and his son came into the investigation's focus again, but not for long. Police officers requested documents and records from the worker that confirmed his whereabouts at the time of the tragedy. The worker immediately presented an officially issued work list signed by his employer stating that he had worked the entire 4th of April at a completely different site. Additionally, his words were confirmed by a recording from a city bus camera showing the worker at the 17th stop at exactly 15:55. Thus, the version about the gardener's involvement finally collapsed. It seemed as if the picture of the crime was completely determined, but the investigation still awaited one more disturbing and extremely important episode. During the detailed examination of Blake's laptop, experts were able to restore a deleted search query that the teenager had previously tried to hide. The query was short and frighteningly direct: how to decapitate fast. The date of this query could not be determined, but digital evidence specialists were able to establish that the file with the information was created before the 4th of April, which was confirmed by analysis of the Chrome browser activity log. In other words, Blake intentionally studied such materials long before the day of the tragedy, which became new, important evidence of his targeted preparation for the investigation. Now it was obvious that Blake's attack could not have been a random outburst of anger caused by defeat in the online game. He planned what happened in advance, consciously and cold-bloodedly. The hall of Dunedin High Court was overcrowded. In 10 months of court proceedings, the small town had learned every fact of this case. But today, the final point was to be made. Judge Robert Gilmore read clearly and decisively the court decision. Blake K. is fully guilty and acted without accomplices. The motive: uncontrolled anger after defeat in the online game and the humiliation the teenager was exposed to in the school chat. The investigation proved that this was not an impulsive reaction. Blake carefully planned the attack for at least a week, beginning no later than the 30th of March. The entire chronology and all details of the tragedy were carefully reconstructed down to minutes and seconds. The court re-examined the correspondence between Blake and Ethan on Discord, which was conducted between 15:10 and 15:35 on the day of the crime. These messages were not ordinary teenage quarreling. The expertise confirmed that Blake openly threatened Ethan because of intentional losing in the online game. The finally angered teenager went to the garage, which Ring system cameras recorded at 15:42. He took the garden machete that he had already prepared in advance. The strikes against the metal post of the greenhouse were executed at exactly 16:05 when Ethan was inside. 3 strikes were registered by security sensors. Another quieter one was made with the shears that belonged to Ethan's family. This additional strike could only be heard by the neighbor, who immediately called the police afterward. Investigators and experts established that Blake tried to cover the traces of the attack by undertaking arson with polyethylene, which was confirmed by fragments found at the crime scene. The appearance of smoke and burning smell was first noticed by neighbors, which brought additional confirmation of the attempt to eliminate traces. The most important evidence was the recovered search query that Blake had deleted on his laptop. Police experts could confirm that Blake had entered a query before the 4th of April that demonstrated a clearly thought-out plan. The query sounded quite harsh. How to quickly sever a head. This became the main argument confirming the teenager's premeditation. Blake's defense made a last attempt to change the course of the case. The lawyers insisted on the so-called gamer effect. They proved that the teenager acted impulsively without fully understanding the consequences of his actions. This line of defense led to contradictory conclusions from psychiatrists. Part of the specialists leaned toward the version of an impulsive emotional outburst, the other toward a cold-blooded and pre-planned crime. The court carefully studied all statements, including the test strike against the old mattress clearly recorded on the Ring camera, which Blake performed on the 30th of March. This detail, in combination with the search history, convinced the court of the premeditated character of the defendant's actions. The session lasted several hours before the judge read the final verdict, summarizing the months-long work of investigation and court proceedings. Tense silence reigned in the courtroom as Judge Gilmore announced the final decision. The verdict was strict and unambiguous. The Dunedin High Court found Blake K. fully guilty of premeditated assault. The teenager received a sentence of 17 years of juvenile detention, after which he must continue serving the sentence in an adult correctional facility. The court decision was announced emotionlessly, clearly and dryly. The judge set the final point by briefly striking with the wooden gavel. The session was closed. Journalists and spectators began slowly dispersing, and Blake silently left the courtroom under guard of court officers. The corridor closed behind him, and for many residents of Dunedin, this meant the end of one of the darkest chapters in the small town's history.